The military base buzzed with restless energy as the sun faded behind the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of dying orange, while the elite strike team lounged around the briefing room laughing too loud and boasting too much their voices. Echoing with arrogance, they had heard rumors that a new commander was coming, someone with authority to lead them on high-risk missions. But the idea amused them because they believed no one could handle this unit except those who had survived. Countless wars like them, they passed around jokes about how the new commander would probably be some desk officer who had never tasted real combat. And the room erupted in cruel laughter as one of them mimicked a clueless officer waving papers. Instead of weapons, unaware that every second of their mockery was being recorded by silent security cameras watching from above as if waiting for something significant to unfold. Then the door at the far end of the room creaked as if pushed by a hesitant visitor. But when it opened, there was no high-ranking officer, no grizzled veteran, only a woman in simple civilian clothes, walking in with calm steps and unreadable eyes. The laughter stopped for a beat, then exploded again, even louder. As one soldier leaned forward, smirking, and asked if she was lost or delivering coffee, another told her the kitchen was in the other building, while another waved dismissively, saying this area was restricted to real soldiers, their disrespect polluted the air with condescension, but the woman did not react. Her expression remained steady, her breathing controlled, like someone trained to ignore noise and see only the target ahead. Yet no one noticed the weight in her gaze or the scars barely hidden. Along her knuckles or the faint military posture she could not hide, no matter how casual her clothes appeared, as though she was a dormant storm, waiting for the right moment to unleash its fury. She stepped further into the room and slid a sealed folder onto the central table. The soldiers scoffed until one glanced at the label and his smile vanished. The file bore a red classified mark that only top command could access. His eyes widened, but before he could speak, she calmly pulled out a uniform from under her arm, neatly folded and pristine. The rank displayed on the shoulders made the room freeze like ice had seeped into their veins. The atmosphere shifted instantly from laughter to disbelief as every pair of eyes locked on the insignia of a commanding officer far higher than anyone present. One soldier tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Another swallowed hard, unable to process the reality that the person they mocked was about to become their superior, and none of them had the courage to stop her as she began unfolding the uniform with slow, deliberate movements like a countdown to something they were not prepared for. The silence grew suffocating as she placed the uniform on the table, her fingers brushing the fabric. With familiarity forged in battlefields, the soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to challenge her or stay quiet. Their confidence crumbled under the seriousness of the moment, but still a few clung to arrogance, asking for proof, demanding authorization, insisting it had to be some kind of mistake. She did not argue. Instead, she reached into the classified file and pulled out mission reports stamped with clearances they had never seen. She recited their names one by one, not just their names, but their service numbers, their hidden disciplinary records, their unfinished missions, and the secrets they thought no one else knew. The room grew colder with each revelation as she exposed details from top-secret missions that even they had forgotten, proving she had access to information far beyond anything they imagined. And finally they realized this was no ordinary officer, and certainly no imposter, but someone who had been watching them long before stepping into this room. The weight of her presence became undeniable, and tension strangled the air as she finally lifted the uniform from the table and began slipping into it. Each motion executed with military precision, muscle memory guiding every button, and each movement echoing years of discipline, pain, and warfare. The soldiers stood frozen, watching as authority materialized before their eyes, replacing the image of a helpless outsider with the form of a leader forged in shadows. One of them instinctively straightened his posture. Another lowered his gaze, ashamed of the words he had thrown earlier, as if realizing he had mocked a lion while believing it was a lamb. The room that once overflowed with laughter now felt like a battlefield. Moments before detonation, and the commander had not even spoken a single word. Yet somehow she already controlled the space commanding respect without force, leaving them stunned at how easily power shifted the moment truth was revealed. She finished, putting on the uniform, and looked up at them, her eyes sharp, cold, and silently measuring each of them like a predator, evaluating the strength of its pack. But just as she opened her mouth to speak, the lights flickered, the air conditioner went silent, and an eerie stillness fell over the entire facility. A red emergency light began flashing in the hallway beyond the door, accompanied by a distant alarm that grew louder with each pulse. Something was happening outside, something that had nothing to do with scheduled drills or routine alerts, the soldiers' tensed muscles coiling like springs trying to decode the sudden shift in atmosphere. But deep within her eyes, a different understanding flickered as though she had been expecting this moment all along, and maybe this was the real reason she had arrived earlier than scheduled. Footsteps thundered down the hallway outside the door as someone sprinted toward the room, urgency burning in every stride. The door burst open and a junior officer stumbled inside, breathless eyes wide with terror. He tried to speak, but his voice shook as he pointed toward the monitors behind them. The screens flickered with live feed, showing the outer perimeter of the base under lockdown armed personnel, scrambling in confusion as warning symbols flashed across every status panel. Something or someone had breached the system, something dangerous enough to trigger the highest level of alert. Without warning, the soldiers looked at one another then, at her as if instinctively waiting for her orders. Even though she had not officially taken command yet, she remained motionless for a second, her expression unreadable, while the room trembled with chaos just beyond their walls. Then she took a single step forward, her presence suddenly heavier than before, and in that moment every soldier understood something they had missed entirely since the moment she walked in. She did not just belong here, she was built for this. She had faced dangers they could not comprehend, survived wars they had never heard of, and commanded units so deep in classified operations that their existence was erased from records. The laughter that once filled the room felt like a distant memory swallowed by the rising tension as realization dawned on them. All this was not a coincidence. This was the calm before the storm, and she was the only one ready to face it. But just as she prepared to speak, the monitors glitched static, drowning the image before a shadowy figure appeared on the screen, staring directly into the camera as if aware of who was watching. And with a slow, chilling motion, the figure lifted a hand and pointed straight at her, leaving the room frozen in shock as the alarm grew louder, and the lights dimmed once more. And before anyone could move, the feed cut to black, leaving only her calm, steady breathing in the silence as the storm outside finally began to break. The room pulsed with the red glow of the emergency lights as the soldiers stared at the black screen in stunned silence, unsure whether the shadowy figure they saw was real or some kind of system malfunction. But the intensity in the air felt too heavy, too deliberate for coincidence. The junior officer stood frozen by, the door trembling as if he had seen death itself approaching, while the others shifted uneasily, waiting for someone to make sense of the chaos that lurked just outside their walls. Yet the only person moving with certainty was her. She stepped toward the monitor's, eyes narrowed, calculating every detail. Even in static, she could see patterns she recognized from a past mission, one that had been buried in classified archives and never spoken of again, because the aftermath was too dangerous to reveal. And as the memory surfaced like a ghost from the deep, she realized the enemy was not only back, but already inside. She turned toward the soldiers, and the weight of her gaze snapped them out of their confusion. Her calm voice carried no emotion, yet it cut through the tension like a blade as she commanded everyone to take their gear and prepare for immediate deployment. Some hesitated, still processing the reality that the woman they mocked minutes ago was now taking control of the situation with terrifying precision. But there was something in her tone that left no room for argument. It was the voice of someone who had survived things that would break most men, and suddenly even the most stubborn soldiers found themselves moving without question, grabbing weapons, checking ammo, and falling into formation as muscle memory overtook pride. Yet beneath their movements lingered a single burning question. How did she know exactly what to do before anyone had even explained what was happening, as if she had already been here once before and seen the future unfold? Outside the briefing room, the base was in disarray, alarms, blaring radios crackling with panicked voices, and security teams struggling to seal off access. Points as unidentified hostiles moved like shadows through the outer sectors, cutting power lines, disabling cameras, and evading detection with tactical precision. This was not a random attack, but a coordinated strike, executed by professionals who knew the layout of the facility too well. The smell of burning metal seeped through the air, and the sound of distant gunfire echoed through the corridors as soldiers sprinted past with fear in their eyes. She led her team through the chaos without slowing, scanning every corner, every doorway, every ceiling, like a predator tracking prey. The soldiers behind her whispered to each other, asking how she remained so calm, but deep down, they were beginning to understand. This was not her first time walking into a war zone unprepared and outnumbered. She was built for it, and that realization both comforted and terrified them. They reached the central command hallway where security doors had been forced open. As if ripped apart by sheer power, sparks flickered from severed wires while the scent of ozone filled the corridor. One soldier examined the damage and muttered that no human could do this, but she knelt beside the broken panel, her hands gliding over the torn metal as recognition flashed in her eyes. She remembered a weapon capable of this kind of destruction, one developed by a covert unit. She once belonged to a weapon that was never officially approved and was supposed to be destroyed, but clearly someone had kept it, and now it was being used by an enemy who knew everything about her past. She stood slowly, her jaw tightening as the truth formed like ice in her chest. This was not an attack on the base. This was an attack on her, and the soldiers behind her unknowingly stood on the edge of a war far bigger than anything they had trained for. A sudden boom shook the hallway as the floor vibrated beneath their feet, dust raining from the ceiling while distant screams rang out. Mixed with gunfire somewhere deep within the base, something catastrophic had just been unleashed, and they were running out of time. She ordered the team to split into pairs to secure key sectors. One soldier objected, saying they needed more intel, but she cut him off with a single glance that silenced all doubt. Her authority was no longer questioned, as she assigned each soldier with precision based on their skills and habits. She knew which ones were sharpshooters, which had medical training, which excelled in breaching, and which panicked under pressure. She knew them better than they knew themselves, and they did not understand how. But they followed, because something told them that if they ignored her even for a second, they would die. Before understanding what killed them, as the team scattered through the facility, the emergency lights flickered to the rhythm of distant explosions, casting shadows that twisted like living things along the walls. She led a smaller group toward the lower levels where the power generators were located. If the enemy controlled the energy source, they could shut down the entire base trap, everyone inside, and cut off outside contact. They moved quickly, boots pounding against metal flooring, as echoes followed them like ghosts. Each turn they took felt darker and deeper, like descending into the belly of something alive and waiting. One of the soldiers whispered that this felt like a setup, like someone was hurting them, and she agreed. Quietly, but kept moving because the only way to beat the trap was to walk straight into it and break it from the inside before it snapped shut. They reached the generator room, but something was wrong. The door was already open and the guards assigned to this sector were gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just eerie silence, and the humming of machines still running as if untouched. She raised her fist, signaling the team to stay back as she assessed the room. The air was too clean, too still, and there was a faint metallic scent that did not belong. She recognized it instantly, the chemical trace of a stealth toxin used in high-level assassination missions, the kind that killed silently in seconds, leaving no evidence she had used it. Before, and the memory made her stomach twist. It meant the enemy was not only skilled, but trained, in the same methods she had been trained in, which meant they were not just former soldiers, they were former allies, or worse. They were ghosts from her own past coming back for unfinished business. Her heartbeat slowed as she approached the nearest console. Her fingers gliding over the interface, accessing logs to see who last entered the room. But instead of data, the screen displayed a single message written in cold white letters across a black background, and the words sent a chill through every vein in her body because they were meant for her specifically, and no one else. "Welcome back, Commander. We have been waiting. The soldiers behind." Her read the message and stepped back in fear, staring at her as though seeing her for the first time, piecing together the horrifying reality that whoever was attacking them not only knew who she was, but had planned this entire operation around. Her existence, everything that was happening, was part of a larger game, and she was the key piece in play. She turned slowly, eyes burning with a mixture of fury and grim understanding, because now she knew exactly who was behind this and why they had resurfaced. But before she could speak, the lights went out, completely plunging them into darkness, as heavy footsteps echoed from somewhere in the shadows, growing louder with every breath. And the moment before the enemy revealed themselves, she whispered a name no one on her team had ever heard before. A name that should have stayed buried in classified history, yet was now walking straight toward them, ready to finish what was started long ago. The darkness inside the generator room felt alive, as if the shadows themselves were breathing slowly, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Every soldier gripped their weapons tighter, eyes straining to find any sign of movement, but the silence pressed against their ears, making every heartbeat sound like thunder. She stood at the front, unmoving like a statue carved from war itself. Her eyes locked on the direction of the approaching footsteps, because she already knew who it was, and the weight of that name lingered in the air, like poison ready to unleash old wounds. The sound grew louder, steady, confident, unhurried, like someone who knew exactly how much fear they could create just by walking closer. And as the soldiers exchanged anxious glances, they realized something. Terrifying, whoever was coming was not afraid of them at all. The footsteps stopped just beyond the doorway, and for a moment time froze. No one dared to breathe. Then a figure stepped into the faint emergency glow, revealing a tall silhouette armored in matte black tactical gear with no insignia or identification, but the way they carried themselves, the way they surveyed the room without anxiety or rush, spoke of experience and authority. This was not a soldier, this was a commander of killers. The figure tilted their head slightly as if amused by the sight in front of them and slowly removed their helmet, revealing a face that made her team recoil in shock because this enemy looked calm, composed, and disturbingly familiar, as though they had once stood on the same side of the battlefield, and she did not flinch even as her team whispered in confusion, struggling to understand who this stranger was, but deep within her eyes burned the recognition of someone who had expected this confrontation for years and dreaded it more than death itself. The enemy smiled with chilling calm and spoke her name, not her rank, not her title, but the name she used before the world knew her, before the military shaped her into a living weapon. And her team froze because they had never heard anyone speak to her like that before. The enemy stepped closer, unfazed by the rifles trained on them, and spoke about missions long erased from history, about decisions that had cost lives, and about the day everything changed, the day she had been forced to choose loyalty over morality, and someone had paid the price with everything they had, that someone now stood before her alive and burning with vengeance. The soldiers watched as the truth unfolded piece by piece, and the realization spread like wildfire. This attack was not random. This was personal, This was revenge, and she was at the center of it all. Her grip tightened on her weapon, but she did not raise it, not yet, because she knew. The enemy wanted her to react, wanted her to lash out so they could justify what was coming. Instead, she spoke calmly, asking how they survived when the mission report declared them dead. The enemy laughed softly, a sound devoid of warmth, and revealed they were never meant to survive. They were meant to be silenced because they knew too much, because the mission had been a cover-up, and she had walked away with secrets powerful enough to destroy entire chains of command. And now the past stood in front of her, wearing the armor of an executioner determined to make her pay. The soldiers listened in stunned silence, realizing they were standing in the middle of a story buried by classified files, a story soaked in betrayal and blood, and they were only beginning to understand how deep it went. Before anyone could react, the enemy snapped their fingers and the lights flickered back on, revealing dozens of armed operatives positioned around the room, surrounding them with lethal precision. These were not ordinary fighters. They moved with synchronized steps like a single entity. Each one trained in the same methods as her elite skills forged in secret programs that the world believed were shut down years ago. The soldiers' backs pressed against the cold machinery as they were forced into a defensive circle, outnumbered and outmatched. But she stepped forward, placing herself between her team and the enemy, her posture unshaken despite the overwhelming odds, because she had faced impossible battles before and survived. But something in her eyes hinted that this time it was different. This time, survival alone would not be enough, and the enemy seemed to know it too as they stared at her with the confidence of someone who believed they had already won. The enemy spoke again, offering a chance surrender, and perhaps her soldiers would be spared. Resist, and everyone in this room would die slowly and painfully. Her team looked at her, panic creeping into their eyes. They trusted her, but they did not understand the history that stood before them. They could not comprehend the weight of the decision she now faced. She could feel their fear, and she hated it. She hated that her past had reached into the present, to threaten those under her command. But she also knew that surrender was never an option, because people like the enemy did not keep promises, they erased witnesses. She turned slightly, glancing at her team, her voice low but steady, telling them to be ready for her signal. They nodded without hesitation, despite the terror, because something about her presence, even in this nightmare, made them believe they still had a chance to survive. Without warning, the enemy raised their hand, and the operatives aimed their weapons, waiting for the order to fire. The air trembled with tension as every soldier braced for the inevitable. She exhaled slowly, steadying her heartbeat, recalling every brutal lesson burned into her during training, every sacrifice, every loss, every moment that had forged her into who she was today. Then she moved faster than anyone could react, diving forward, grabbing one of the operatives and twisting his arm until his weapon turned on his own ally. Chaos erupted as gunfire exploded across the room. Sparks flew, bodies collided, and the confined space turned into a deadly maze of bullets and smoke. Her soldiers followed her lead, fighting with desperate strength, while she carved through the enemy with fluid precision. Each strike swift, each decision lethal. Yet even as she fought, she kept her eyes on the enemy commander, who stood back, watching the battle unfold with unnerving patience, as though this violence was merely the opening act. The fight raged on, and her team held their own, but the enemy operatives were relentless, their formation never fully breaking their attacks, coordinated with chilling accuracy. It was clear this unit had trained together for years, and they were prepared for every possible counterattack, except one hers. She anticipated their movements like reading a map. She broke their patterns, disrupted their communication, and protected her team like a shield of iron. Yet even as they pushed the enemy back, she sensed something was wrong. The enemy commander had not moved, not intervened, not reacted as if they were waiting for something. waiting for a moment only they could sense, and just as the final operative fell to the ground, silence washed over the room like a cold wave, pressing against the walls, and the enemy commander finally stepped forward, smiling as if everything had gone exactly according to plan. Her instincts screamed danger, but before she could act, the enemy pressed a small device on their wrist, and the floor beneath them vibrated with an ominous hum. Machinery roared to life within the walls, and sudden realization crashed over her. They had not come to win this fight. They had come to delay them. The real attack was happening elsewhere, and every second spent here brought them closer to catastrophe. She looked at her soldiers, their faces bruised but determined, ready to keep fighting, but deep inside, she knew this was far from over because the enemy had just revealed their true strategy. And this battle was just a distraction hiding something far more devastating waiting in the shadows. And as the structure around them began to shift with mechanical precision, sealing exits and preparing for something that could annihilate them, all she understood with chilling clarity that the real war had only just begun, and the price of failure this time would be everything. The shadow moved closer, and the dim emergency lights flickered across the walls as she narrowed her eyes, ready to strike, because every instinct told her this was the moment everything would change, and she could feel the tension coil inside her like a drawn bow, ready to unleash chaos. Yet she waited because she needed to know if this was friend or foe, and then a familiar voice whispered her name in a tone she had not heard in years, making her pulse freeze as she tried to understand why that voice was here now, in the middle of this dangerous mission, leaving her mind racing with possibilities that none of them felt safe. She stepped forward and demanded to see the face behind the voice, but before the figure could answer, footsteps echoed from the hallway, growing louder with every second, forcing her to decide whether to fight or hide, and she knew neither option felt ideal as her team was still recovering from the betrayal they had just faced, and trust had been shattered like glass thrown against stone, so instead she kept her stance ready to attack while her mind screamed to uncover the truth of why this person from her past had suddenly appeared, leaving her with more questions than answers and no time to process any of them. The figure revealed himself, and her heart stopped as she recognized someone she once trusted, someone she thought was dead. Someone she never expected to see again, and the shock rippled through her body, making it hard to breathe. But before she could react, he lifted his hands and said he was not the enemy, but his words meant nothing without proof, and she knew it could be a trap orchestrated by the traitor to break her focus and divide the team further. And yet something in his eyes looked real. Something in his stance carried the weight of truth, which made her hesitate just long enough for him to warn her that danger was already inside the base, waiting to strike, leaving her stunned by the urgency in his tone. She pressed him for answers, demanding to know how he had survived and why he had stayed hidden for so long. But before he could answer, the lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness, thick as fog, and silence followed like the breath before a storm. Then the sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the corridor, sending shivers down her spine, because she knew that sound belonged to enemy gear, and they were no longer alone inside these walls. So she motioned for him to stay close while she moved forward slowly, listening for the slightest shift in air, trying to detect the incoming threat that she knew was closing in on them with deadly precision. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from the far end of the hall, lighting up the darkness with flashes of muzzle fire, and she reacted instantly, diving for cover and dragging him with her as bullets ripped through the air where they had stood moments before, and she could hear the voices of her team shouting orders and returning fire, which meant the enemy had already breached the inner defenses, and chaos had consumed the base, and yet she could not shake the thought that this attack was too coordinated, too perfect, like someone had spoon-fed the enemy every detail of their layout and strategy, which confirmed her fear that the traitor was still feeding them information, and worse, was possibly inside their ranks right now watching everything unfold. She moved through the shadows, calculating every step, while the man from her past followed close behind, and even though she still questioned his intentions, she could not deny that he moved with the precision of someone who understood danger and survival, and when they reached a corner, he grabbed her arm and warned her to stop moments before a grenade rolled across the floor and exploded in a blast of fire that would have destroyed them both if they had stepped forward. And she stared at him, realizing he might actually be telling the truth, that he might be here to help, not harm. But she also knew trust had a price, and she could not afford to pay it yet, even. As the battle raged around them, they pressed deeper into the base, trying to reach the command center, where the security feeds could reveal the traitor. But the corridors were filled with smoke and the sound of collapsing structures, as if the entire building was groaning under the weight of destruction, and every step felt like walking through a battlefield of betrayal and fear, and yet she kept moving, driven by a fire inside her that refused to let the enemy win. And when they finally reached the reinforced doors of the command center, she placed her hand on the scanner only to realize the system had been overridden from the inside, meaning someone was already in control, and they were waiting for her to arrive like a spider waiting. In its web for the final struggle to begin, she drew her weapon and prepared to breach the door, knowing this could be a trap. But there was no turning back, because the longer they waited, the more power the traitor would gain, and the more lives would be lost, and she could not allow that. So she glanced at the man beside her one last time, and he nodded silently, acknowledging the danger they were about to face, and even though the mission had spiraled into something far more personal and complicated than she expected, she gathered her strength and pushed forward, ready to face whatever was on the other side of that door. As the air grew colder and the hum of machinery slowed like the calm before a deadly storm, while the silence deepened into something heavy and unnatural, making her wonder if she was already too late to stop the nightmare waiting within the darkness that lay just beyond the door, ready to be unleashed. She stepped through the door expecting enemy fire, but instead, she saw every screen displaying her own face, marked as the primary threat, and the traitor stood smiling in the center of the room, holding the detonator ready to erase everything, forcing her to choose between revenge and sacrifice. As the final second ticked away,